Nick Wagner's existence in High Potential doesn't just add another name to the board. It quietly reshapes the emotional gravity between Morgan and Karadec in a way the show had been deliberately holding back. What's fascinating is that Nick doesn't need a lot of screen time or dramatic monologues to do this. The mere confirmation that he exists, that Morgan has a past with weight, history, and unresolved emotional residue, immediately reframes how we read her present-day interactions with Karadec. Suddenly, their dynamic isn't just about professional friction or mutual curiosity anymore. It becomes about timing, restraint, and the slow realization that something meaningful is forming whether either of them is ready for it or not. Before Nick Wagner enters the narrative space, Morgan and Karadec's chemistry feels intentionally suspended. There's banter, trust, and a growing ease between them, but it's carefully coded as something that could still go in multiple directions. The show positions their connection as organic rather than forced, rooted in shared competence and intellectual respect. However, without an external emotional anchor, that slow burn risks stagnation. Nick's existence solves that problem instantly. He gives Morgan a clearly defined emotional past, and by extension, gives Karadec something to measure himself against, even if he never consciously does so. What makes this work is that Nick is not introduced as a villain or a romantic obstacle in the traditional sense. He isn't painted as toxic, abusive, or obviously wrong for Morgan. Instead, he represents something more realistic and therefore more disruptive, a man who mattered, a relationship that once made sense, and a version of Morgan that existed before the one Karadec knows. This subtlety is crucial. If Nick were clearly bad, the audience would instinctively root against him, and the slow burn would become predictable. Instead, his presence forces the audience, and Karadec, to sit with ambiguity. For Morgan, Nick's existence grounds her character emotionally. She's often portrayed as sharp, unconventional, and slightly guarded, and Nick helps explain why. He represents a chapter of her life where she likely invested deeply, maybe even compromised parts of herself, only for things not to last. That kind of history doesn't disappear. It informs how she navigates closeness moving forward. When Morgan interacts with Karadec after Nick is established in the narrative, her restraint feels more intentional. She's not oblivious to the chemistry. She's cautious because she's been here before. Karadec, on the other hand, becomes more compelling precisely because of how little he says about Nick. The show smartly avoids turning him into a jealous or territorial figure. Instead, his reactions are subtle. A pause, a shift in tone, a slightly more guarded posture. These small behavioral changes suggest awareness rather than insecurity. Karadec doesn't see Nick as competition to defeat. He sees him as proof that Morgan's emotional world is deeper than he initially assumed. That realization raises the stakes for him internally, even if he never articulates it out loud. This is where the slow burn truly ignites. Without Nick, Morgan and Karadec's relationship could drift comfortably in the realm of will they, won't they, without ever gaining urgency. Nick introduces contrast. He becomes the silent benchmark against which Karadec's connection with Morgan is measured, not in terms of intensity, but in authenticity. Nick represents familiarity and history. Karadec represents growth and possibility. The show doesn't rush to declare one better than the other, which is exactly why the tension works. Another important aspect is how Nick's existence reinforces the show's commitment to emotional realism. In real life, people don't enter new connections as blank slates. Past relationships linger, not as ghosts to be exorcised, but as reference points. High Potential leans into this truth, rather than avoiding it. Morgan doesn't need to constantly talk about Nick for him to matter. His relevance is felt in the way she hesitates, deflects, or chooses her words carefully around Karadec. That restraint becomes part of the romance rather than a barrier to it. For the audience, Nick's presence sharpens engagement. Viewers begin watching Morgan and Karadec more closely, reading between lines, tracking micro-expressions, and anticipating moments that might finally tip the balance. Every shared glance now carries added weight because we know what's at stake emotionally. The slow burn stops being passive and becomes actively charged. We're no longer just waiting for something to happen. We're watching two people slowly realize that what they're building might actually matter enough to risk being hurt again. Crucially, the show avoids using Nick as a plot device that needs to be resolved quickly. He isn't there just to be discarded so Morgan can move on. His existence lingers, which mirrors how real emotional history works. That lingering presence allows Morgan and Karadec's connection to develop at a pace that feels earned. When they do eventually cross certain emotional lines, whether through vulnerability, conflict, or mutual acknowledgement, it will feel significant precisely because it wasn't easy. In the end, Nick Wagner's role in High Potential isn't about love triangles or rivalry. It's about context. He gives Morgan depth, gives Karadec perspective, and gives their relationship a foundation of emotional realism. His existence kickstarts the slow burn not by pushing Morgan and Karadec together, but by reminding both of them what it actually means to let someone matter. And that's why the tension between them doesn't feel manufactured. It feels inevitable, slow, and worth the wait.